Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Mountain Dew Spark of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Dimmu Borgir Benefit Show, and to clarify, not them playing one, but to just help the guys out.
I could tell. And I am the black metal guy, aka 90s hardline band called Nelson Mandala.
Oh man, with the last remaining Krishna core band.
Yeah, you get some Eastern mysticism, some post-colonial revolution, and some no drugs, no animal eating, and no abortion.
You can't do anything fun with those guys.
The ultimate sort of ultimate radical centrist Puritanism. It's just like, they're not left wing, they're not right wing, they just hate fun.
Oh man, so they'd be perfect for the hardcore scene of 2022.
Except for the right wing part, yeah.
Well, I think we haven't done like a news segment in a while, but I think you actually have things to share from the co-prosperity sphere.
Yes, indeed. We've been a little, we've been minimal on some of these episodes because we've got. Well, did we do a show starter last week? I can't.
Yeah, we did because we covered the Phenom record. My buddy.
That's right. But anyway, so today we also have a show starter. We've got a submission. I'm a little backlogged on submissions, so things that we've been meaning to cover at the beginning of the show. So before we get to this, I'll just say what's coming up. First off, our boys at Sepulchral Curse have released a new EP. An EP from a band like that is kind of like an album, so we'll cover it at the start of the show, but I think I want time for both of us to listen to it, and we just haven't had time yet. So that's coming soon. Also, we got a submission about a month ago, a very nice submission email from a listener who has a band called Chasm Shroud, and we've been too crazy busy to get to that. We will get to you. There's also a single out this coming week by Holy Death, which is a band from LA, kind of in the vein of Ruin, I think. And the promo also referenced Xibalba and stuff like that. So I'm like, interested. Chasm Shroud is like straight ahead black metal. So Holy Death is if that piques your interest, you can check it out this week when it comes out. But other than that, we'll get it on the show soon. And now, today we got a demo that's out on the 3rd. This is Grave Chalice's demo 2022, but in Roman numerals, on Mercurial Gate. Mercurial Gate is a new imprint run by TW, who does vocals and percussion here, and who is also Varg in Heretical Sect, or Warg, I suppose, in Heretical Sect. And so, yeah, so this is, he just sent this in to us, and it is sort of I haven't given a thorough listen yet. We're just going to do the thing where we listen to one track and talk about it, but it's a black metal industrial kind of thing, and the promo is honestly kind of worth reading. It's got some cool. I was sold by the promo before I listened to it. Saturated in the gloom of vampiric lore and gothic okay, well, whatever. Grave Chalice looms confidently between black metal and industrial music. Okay, they formed the band during lockdown and stuff. Blah blah blah. Let's see. They've got 3 dudes. One guy is like doing dedicated kind of pedal noise stuff, which is cool. And other than that, it's the vocals, percussion, and we've got another guy doing guitars and programming and stuff. Members, the other guy, presumably the guitarist, is also in Inferi, which is kind of a prog black band that early wave of arty Americanized black metal. They were in there really early, but because it had more in common with late 90s, early 2000s prog black by, like, Enslaved or, like, Borknagar or whatever, they just didn't take off in the same way. But so the guitarist from there, and they wanted to draw on, Scandinavian black metal and industrial, so like Thorns, Mysticum, and Ministry. So that seems pretty cool. And they've also got a lyrical concept about how, technology is turning us into vampires by prolongating life into a living death, which is a nice angle. So I thought, let's give it a listen. This first track is Descending Mirror of Ascension. All right, death metal guy, what do you make of that?
It's pretty good. It's a very grand declaration of war. The conceit seems to be like, what if we took the kind of electronic and industrial aspects of Grand Declaration of War seriously? And then it also kind of reminds me of Oppress from the UK.
It's a lot like Oppress, isn't it?
Yeah, this is like less chaotic and cluttered, but definitely this isn't too far from that last EP we heard from Oppress that we covered last year.
Yeah. Oppressed is, more sort of... Oppressed has sort of dramatic song structures that are very kind of metal, right? Whereas this is more... this really gets... There's no like, specifically industrial rhythmic structures there, except that it's, like, programmed. But, like... It has the horizontal feel of industrial music, right? These are sort of extended grooves, but that are substantial. As far as things that stuck out to me, the beginning of the track is right. These kind of basically just, you definitely get that kind of that palm muted skronk riff, which is probably those are on Grand Declaration, right?
Yeah. Now that opening main riff is very similar. Yeah, that sort of dual channel stuff that Blasphemer was doing a lot back then.
And also on, like, I don't know, the Enslaved albums that, you like, Runa Nisa and whatever. Yeah, that, or
even some of the kind of classic era Blood Oss Nord stuff also. Sort of proto-Orthodox in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so that's, and one thing I noticed is, like, a riff like that, those have become, to some degree, those are now, they're not common exactly, but they're a thing you would expect to hear in an Orthodox band or something, or certain kinds of arty band, right? So when you hear it the first, I found that, initially I'm like, well, this is cool, but I wasn't necessarily struck by it as a riff. But when it comes back, there's this great sort of really well-done triplet breakdown in the middle of it, where the song could just ride that kind of groove the whole time, right? And then just end. But instead it does the sort of classic Scandinavian BM thing of the switch to, a 3 against 4 thing. There's really cool melodic ideas there. And then there's some blasting that's not phoned in. And when the main riff it's punctuation, but it's not phoned in. And when the main riff comes back, the main riff sounds really good. It's like, oh, cool, there's the groove.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually finds its way back to that riff in a pretty naturalistic way. It doesn't feel like it's forced to be a chorus or to function like one.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's forced, and when it returns, it's like, welcome. It's like, oh, that was a good riff. I like hearing that riff again. Also, what do you make of the other electronic stuff?
I think there's cool stuff happening. It's just kind of subdued in the production to the point where it's hard to see. It's like, is that going to be a main fixture of the music, or is that more for atmospheric texture? I think that's something that'll have to be answered in future releases, because I like some of the tones and stuff, but they're really backgrounded in the production. So it's like, is this... the question is, do we want it to be more prominent, or do we want it as a textural aspect to the music?
And I wonder if the rest of the EP... the thing they've done with the conceit for this band is really nice, because they've given themselves a spectrum, right? You can work from stuff like this song, which is more close to a Mysticum-type track or whatever, to... you could move closer to wax track stuff, and you could move closer to noise, right? And it'd be interesting to hear if they explore that more over the course of the demo. You know what? Actually, since we are just simulating the effect of just listening to shit with bros, let me just randomly click through for 10 seconds, and I'll tell you. Okay, Gaping Wounds of Time has some more extended kind of stuff, almost a bit like the Author and Punisher thing we reviewed recently at the end of it. Okay. It's it's an interval in the middle of the song, but it's significant, and there's like big synth tones going on around with the noise there. So okay, there's a little more there. Overall, the song is very much structured like a 9-minute black metal song, I think, but. Okay, yep, and Hammer of Derision, they're actually doing more of a, you can hear the Ministry thing more. There's like mechanized punk beat kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think there's real possibility. I'm going to listen to the whole thing for sure, and I think there's, a demo is about sort of, shooting out your possibility matrix and seeing what's there, and there's a lot to explore here. I think this is a very promising project.
Hi, this is Taylor from Crushing the Scepter, and you're listening to Terminus Podcast.
And we are back from discussing cicadas as noise music artists to discuss a record we've both been looking forward to for a long time. This is the debut full-length of Aparthiva Raktadhara, and it is titled Adyapeeth Maranasamhita, something like that. And it's out on Iron Bonehead, who have championed this scene, the Kolkata Inner Order, as well as sort of other kind of Indian war metal stuff for a long time. So as far as the most proximate bands, it would be like Tetragrammaticide, right, which is kind of, I mean, they're basically known in their own right now, right?
Yeah.
They're a pretty major band. Yeah, this sort of like Nyarlathotep style nuclear, industrial nuclear Black Death. And then also, Kapala, which is more sort of straightforward sort of meat grinder war metal. This is a very distinct entity. This is sort of whiplashing, gyrating, frenzied, possessed kind of stuff. And it evokes sort of chthonic or night side Hinduism. And they've already, this band, even though they've just put out a demo or an EP and a single before this, they've already attained some notoriety, especially because of their video from the debut EP, Agyat Ishvar. The video from Dismal Anahata Transmissions is some actual IRL paganism, which features this sort of shots of rituals. Who knows? Maybe worshiping deities like Kali, right, or more destructive aspects of Shiva. And it includes things like people dressed as demons and dudes with their heads split by machetes.
It rules.
It is extraordinarily metal. These guys, I mean, this scene has unquestionable seriousness and integrity. And I think as far as a musical format, this is by far the thing I enjoy most off this. And I think we both agree. I mean, what you said just before we started the segment.
Yeah, it's one of the best albums of the year. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be very hard to top this. This is probably like top 3, top 5, and I'm going to listen to it more, and it might creep up even further.
Yeah, this is really cool. So as far as characterizing the music, it's war metal composed entirely of death metal. Mm-hmm. It's black metal only insofar as early Morbid Angel has kind of been godfathered in as a black metal band, right? Insofar it has serious ideological charge and mystical depth to it. And yeah, I think as far as the influences, you would be the person to verify this, but Morbid Angel has got to be by far the main influence here, right? Yeah,
it's definitely Morbid Angel. I think that before we get into the influences, it's really important to note that the first EP by Aparthiva was really cool, but it was a lot closer to the kind of warnoise Kolkata sound than this is. This is like almost a different band in some ways. I mean, the noise has been way toned down. It's still super aggressive and kind of battering. It has that war metal energy, but most of the influences that I can detect on this record are coming straight from, like, Tampa and Quebecois death metal. Morbid Angel is sort of foundational to this, but I think even more proximate is stuff like Cryptopsy. I hear a ton of Cryptopsy in some of the intervallic choices these guys are making on guitars. And also...
that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and also a lot of stuff by Gorguts. Nowadays, with all the Disso death bands, everybody looks to Gorguts Obscura as sort of foundational to that sound. But everyone forgets that even in their initial run, there were another 3 albums around that. And what I think you'll hear a lot on this record is influence from Wisdom to Hate, which was the album after Obscura, where they kind of took a lot of the really bizarre melodic ideas and the strange guitar techniques and kind of pushed them more back into conventional death metal song structures. It wasn't quite as sort of diffuse and wandering as Obscura. So you take all those influences in, and then you distill them down into something that's... It's hard to describe how this record sounds because it's very technical and very fast and very aggressive, but at the same time, like, almost oddly minimal. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like, how would you articulate that? It's like, there's a shit ton going on, it's really fast, but it's like, it's bone dry and stripped down in a way you don't typically hear mixed together.
Yeah, it's very focused on, well, yeah, first of all, the production is, I mean, really what's going on here, I think, is that where a lot of people who are doing I like a lot of Morbid Angel-based war metal, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of those bands are focused more on the Altars of Madness thrashy aspect of it, mm-hmm. and on combining that with a beefier and or noisy production and more classic black metal riffing. And you often end up with something that's in some ways more musically conservative than early Morbid Angel.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, it's just supposed to be manly, crushing heavy metal, right? Mm-hmm. This seems to me the most serious Blessed Are the Sick worship I've heard. And I don't mean worship in the sense of attempting to clone it. I mean focusing on everything that makes that album sort of strange and difficult to digest, and so ahead of its time, still ahead of its time, and drawing out that potential, which is something we've talked on the show about before. It's like a band like Morbid Angel is still ahead of any fucking Disso death band. Right?
Exactly. Well, Blessed Are the Sick is definitely a touchstone, but I'd also argue that this continues in a string of bands that we've been hearing since we started the show, which is really recontextualizing later Morbid Angel, like Steve Tucker era stuff, because the one that I would apply this closest to would be Formula's Fatal to the Flesh. Which kind of takes the really strange intervals of something like Blessed Are the Sick, removes a lot of the sort of lurching slowness and groove, and makes something almost akin to Morbid Angel as a brutal death band.
I gotta hear that.
Oh, dude, it's
I
awesome.
haven't heard that one because usually we associate later Morbid Angel with sort of like the slower stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, well, that's gateways. I mean, you can kind of see Morbid Angel doing like a fast album, slow album thing through a lot of their career. You know, Blessed being the first quote unquote slow one, even though there's stuff that's on it that's faster than anything on Altars. But yeah, no, Formulas is one of their fastest albums ever. It's probably right alongside Covenant. And, but yeah, it's just blistering, weird technicality. It's not songy in the way that a lot of other Morbid Angel albums are, but yeah, you definitely get into that, yeah.
Okay, cool. So, okay, that makes sense. So I gotta hear that. But the thing that really ties it to Blessed Are the Sick, I think, is also just the production, right? Yeah. That album's notable for having a extremely dry, kind of quiet production. Mm-hmm. This isn't quiet, and there's the sounds are a little less narrow in bandwidth. There's a little more width and noise fry coming off the guitars and stuff. But not by much. It is aggressively dry, and it really embraces exactly those parts of early 90s death metal that are supposed to make it dated. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it says, like, the whole point was that this is this Morbid Angel had this deliberately austere way of producing their music, which drew your attention to form and to like geometric or architectural features of the music, like, you know, to like line and pacing and stuff. And this music is a lot like that. There are really just two focal points here, which is these sort of winding, slippery trem-leads and the drums. And it's very focused on those. And even calling them trem-leads is a little weird. So, one thing I wanted to get into for the to move us towards the samples is you know, if this idea of terrible clarity in the sound is part of the altars or part of the Blessed or the Sick aesthetic, one aspect of that is having things. It's not just like, it's not uninterrupted thrash attack, right? In the way that a lot of early black metal and some early death metal is, right? Morbid Angel is all about clearly marked beginnings and ends of phrases and sections. You know, you would say those drum fills, those Sandoval fills.
Yeah.
And they take that tendency to punctuate things and carry it even further, I think, in a more sort of... they make it really integral to how they're doing the thing top to bottom. A lot of what they're doing is just taking the most alienating or unique things about the Morbid Angel and making it more... drawing out all the radical potentials there. So, this is... so, yeah, in terms of musical punctuation, let's go to the first sample. So this is, off the first track, Numinal Wings of Uncreation hover over the excrements of Sunyata. Is this the first black or death metal band to use rests?
Well, I think I didn't even realize you wrote this in the notes when I wrote my notes, comparing a lot of this stuff to sort of brutal death metal riff technique.
Yeah, so one thing to flag there. So that sample includes a full stop between sections of the whole band. And also, that last riff sequence is a great example of how they work. So they work in... the basic unit here isn't the riff or the melody. It's like a run or a sequence, very much like in Brutal Death. And except maybe even more so than in a lot of Brutal Death, the run or the sequence has multiple 2 plus phrases in it. And, well, no, that's true in Brutal Death, too. I mean,
No, I get what you mean, though.
Yeah. They've got the multiple... So that last riff was a really good example. There's this kind of, like... pause, and then this answering phrase that's more blast. They do a choppy thing that's kind of percussive, and then an answering one. And you can hear a pause between them. But that's the whole phrase, and they do that, like, 4 times. The cool thing is that overall, this isn't some wiggly wobbly meandering stuff. The overall frameworks of the song still kind of work like death metal songs. You're still going to get 4 of this and 4 of that, but what you're going to get is 4 of this sequence, 4 of that sequence. And the use, I hope you could hear in that sample, the use of pauses, spaces, and like not just like the single dramatic pause that happens once on one track on an album, right? It's a regular part of technique. It's between sequences, and it's within sequences between individual phrases.
Yeah, it's got that sort of it's deliberately broken up rhythmic characteristic on guitar that you would hear from like late 90s and early 2000s brutal death metal. I'm thinking of bands like Deeds of Flesh, that sort of thing. Sort of the impulses that later turned into very like clicky, sterile, like unique leader brutal death. But before that, when they were just sort of exploring the idea of these, hyper tight kind of compressed musical phrases being used in the place of where more traditional riffs would be.
Yeah, for sure. And so speaking of the riffs themselves, or the phrases, these are more like, a lot of these would work as like bebop licks.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's interesting.
Maybe very atonal free jazz licks. So like a lot of the most avant brutal death we've been reviewing, there's a real convergence here in some ways with jazz. And, just these ideas of phrasing, sequences of phrasing, musical space, these deliberately kind of nonsense melodies made out of these note clusters, right?
They're really into the technique of these sort of like dissonant octave leaps. These sort of a lot of the riffs, probably kind of like the majority of the riffs on this record, are based off of some level of string skipping. Shooting past the octave and then a half step up or down to create this really bizarre dissonant interval, which is something you'd hear a lot from bands like Cryptopsy or Deranged, stuff like that. The really speedy, trem-based brutal death stuff of the 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah, and so speaking of like sort of trem thing, it's weird to call the guitar trem because the phrases themselves are so punctuated. It's not like the individual phrase has a stop in it, right? These are still pretty satisfying, propulsive, death metal licks. But they, instead of using an actual stop, they use rest-like techniques. So they'll suddenly drop to a chug, or they'll hit a sustained scrunk chord. But they're not hanging on those chords or trem-sawing them in the way that lazy Disso Black Death bands do, right? They're using that. That's a kind of newer technique, those chords, as far as I know. Morbid Angel probably had things like that, but, they'll hit these kinds of, like, clustered, harsh, scrunky chords just briefly, and letting it ring just puts some space in the riff itself.
Yeah.
So it's really, there's tremolo riffing happening here, but it's about as far as you can get from endless stream of trem, and it is so controlled and directed. There's really impressive technique here. Yeah.
And a lot of that does have to do with just like certain production choices. Like this wouldn't be as effective if the guitar tone was like more saturated and more distinctly extreme metal in the way. The fact that they've backed off of some of the gain abuse means that you really hear, these stops function rhythmically like they're supposed to, which is something I'm actually going to get into on a later sample. The interesting relationship between rhythmic considerations between the drums and the guitars.
If you played this on acoustic guitar, it would still be brutal.
Yeah, and it would still kind of make sense in a way. You would just think, wow, this jazz is really strange.
Why do I like this so much? Yeah, why would I like this so much?
So, real quick, let me do a sample from the third track, Gnostic Arousal of Shava Lingam. And here we'll get a little bit more into what I perceive as that substantial cryptopsy influence, as well as some of the interesting structural conceits in the riff writing across this whole record.
Dude, that's sick.
Oh yeah, no, that's phenomenal, and you can kind of tell. So this is clearly designed for the vinyl release because that closes out the first side of the record. It makes sense that it ends there and you flip it. So some things that I want to draw attention to. One, the cryptopsy thing really sticks with me because it's not just the intervallic choices, but kind of the way these songs are paced strikes me as like the most aggressive moments on like None So Vile. I'm thinking songs like Dead and Dripping and Lich Mistress, the more kind of grindy ones. They're just kind of perpetually picking up speed and intensity the whole way through. Even if it's not necessarily speeding up, it feels like it's always sort of rising in energy and intensity. Another thing these guys like to do that reminds me a lot of like John Levasseur's guitar work on an older Cryptopsy is the idea of taking these sort of very brief cellular riffs really seriously. You know, building a whole riff out of like a single technical flourish that just repeats over and over again super fast. And you get kind of a more measured version of that at the end of this song, where he's just sticking on that one very strange sort of loop. It's not even really a riff, it's almost like an industrial tape loop or something for like a fucking minute at the end of that song. Which is kind of what allows these guys to play around the edges of doing things a black metal band would, but with completely different technique. Instead of creating a sort of like endless looping riff of, you know, a single trem melody, you just have this sort of broken, almost artificial mechanical figure that just loops in on itself endlessly. So you get that sort of like mystical quality, but without any of the sort of melodic baggage from black metal.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, and I would certainly say that. Yeah, they're the way that these songs are so broken up, but then they know exactly when to commit to a kind of hypnotic repetition is a sign of quality. There were about 3 opportunities for a lesser band to stop playing that riff, and they took none of them.
There's so many off ramps on that highway, and it's like, nope, we're going all the way.
Yes, and there was some meaningful. There was some change in how they were playing it too as they went on. At least 1 or 2 moments where the inflection changed. But yeah, that's a great example. Like, it cycles like a black metal riff. It doesn't. That brings up a broader point I wanted to make. I have much more tolerance for certain kinds of death metal, disjunctive songwriting in death metal than I used to. But I still don't want the stuff that I like best. I don't want to be sound, fragmented, right? And this is not fragmented at all. It's not spazzy. And the internal groove there is a great example. It's totally punctuated. There's a pause between every phrase. And they let those chord. That's a great example of letting the skronk chord ring to sort of space out the riff. But the pause is not the absence of the riff. The pause is part of the riff, and it cycles you into the next one.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's a lot of subtle mechanical features of this record that are constantly running in the background, like certain operating principles that they rely on, time signature choice is a big one. Typically 4/4 riffs are there for those kinds of looping figures, like that one at the end of Gnostic Arousal. Most of this album seems to be built around, based from some of the counts that I did, around 5/4 and 5/4 against 4/4 passages. Sort of an A riff and a B riff that's not different melodically, but one is truncated. And the longer version may be first or it may be second. But that's sort of an operating principle that you'll hear continuously across this record. These longer, more elaborate riffs are given these unique rhythmic spaces to operate in, and the only time they shoot back to 4/4 is for these looping, almost pseudo-industrial moments like that.
Yeah, the industrial sensibility is definitely here throughout. You can hear how it's related to stuff like Tetragrammaticide. And also, one wonders, are some or all of these guys trained in Indian classical music also?
Yeah, I'd be really curious about the kind of musical background of these guys in general.
I think the first EP sounded a bit more folky. It's been a long time since I've listened to it, but I feel like that one sounded a bit like a really cool version of what one might expect Indian war metal to sound like. This doesn't sound folky in any direct way at all, but the grasp on the really crazy range of interval choices, the grasp on those, half steps and stuff, the use of tonalities that fall, outside the Western major-minor dichotomy, right? These things are all sort of built into death metal, certain parts of death metal, but they're also built into Indian classical music, and the really sort of bespoke timing on melodic phrases, right? They're like, okay, we're going to run this one for 4/4, do a few 4/4. Okay, now we're going to run this melody runs 5/4, 4/4, 5/4. Like that seems like Indian classical music kind of stuff. You could write this whole album without any background in that, but it would it certainly activates that kind of tradition, whether it's deliberate or not.
Yeah, definitely. I can see what you mean. I mean, given the sheer breadth of Indian folk and classical tradition, it's entirely possible this is also extremely folky, just in a way that we're not familiar with.
Yes, and even if it's not deliberate, it is arising from the ancestral or mind. I mean, you could imagine a guy playing tablas under this.
Yeah.
So, let's go to My next sample, so since my first one was I wanted to point out all these things about timing and sequencing and whatnot, the second one I figured just pick the cool riff, black metal guy. So this is Omnicidal Samshan Pyre of Calcutta, and this is the shortest, most straightforward track on the record. Here's a war metal song, here's a bunch of sick riffs. And then back into one of the earlier riffs. Dude, death metal guy. These are thrash riffs.
Yeah, I mean, you just... The structural principles are thrash. You just work the intervals around a little bit and you get something really different.
Yeah, so that's something... So when I was initially trying to define what this record was doing, I thought, oh, maybe it's like Morbid Angel without any of the heavy metal or thrashisms. But it's certainly not doing the Altars of Madness thrashing war metal thing. And it's certainly not... There's no heavy metal in this. This is, this is not a... In some sense, this is not a metal record. But in the same way that some of the most out there black metal isn't really metal. But like, it's really drawing on thrash. And, we've talked on the show before many times about how kind of thrash metal proper is kind of a dead end, but that the extreme wings of thrash are interesting. And these guys are... there's actually a ton of thrash here, and what they're focused on is the way that, like, certain kinds of Morbid Angel riffs involve pedal point formulas. Mm-hmm. But you could hear it really clearly on the last one. There's, like, they'll do a tremolo run, they'll drop to a root, they'll do a tremolo run, they'll drop to the same root, then they'll crank the root higher, right? So they do, these are often structured as kind of escalating pedal point sequences as the point that the notes return to changes. There was one before that over a driving thrash beat too, right? There's not a ton of that sort of Slayer style punk drumming here, but there's some. And it's really cool. It's a good sort of moment of release here. And that's one of the moments where they have something that's closer to a long, winding, big riff in the way that we might expect these days.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, really that kind of formula you're describing of having these super dissonant intervals, but kind of bound together with the idea of, okay, A variation, raise up a fifth, and then B variation kind of thing is really essential to, like, the first 4 Morbid Angel records also. You get past some of the sort of the weirdest impulses from Trey Azagtot in terms of note choice, and you arrive at stuff that, like you were saying, really is rooted in thrash tradition. It's just, I mean, the distinguishing features is just the really strange sense of harmony going on. And these guys have basically built a record around that conceit, oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, and the willingness to just, like, change root notes in the middle of a riff, which makes it not sound to us like a thrash riff initially. that's part of what gives Morbid Angel and this music. It's kind of, this music is a little more fluid in some ways than like architectural kind of Blessed Are the Sick kind of stuff, but it's what gives the music such an emphasis on line and contour, right? Is that you have these this vertical motion relative to a bass, and the bass is changing even within the riff. That's just like a lot of giving a fucks per riff. Yeah, to do that.
It's really interesting the way these songs are laid out. I think I've said on the show a few times. This is a record that almost rejects the notion of like tone color and timbre. Like, it sounds very good, but this is one of those records where I've described this on the show. It's like you could read the sheet music for everything, and it's not tremendously different from listening to it. You know what I mean? The emphasis here is entirely upon the content. There's no little additives to give flavor. This is presented, going back to the beginning when we started talking about the record, in the same way as 1992 death metal. This is the music. We have demarcated lines within production to emphasize clarity and regularity. And it's up to you as the listener to derive the full meaning from exactly what's presented.
Yes, it is also, I think, probably something that might jive with both how Morbid Angel and this band think of their music, is that what they're getting at is eternal form. Right? These are sort of melodic ideas that are supposed to stand or fall based purely on the tonal, purely on the tonal and rhythmic connections.
Yeah,
right. It's not,
which makes this so much more like classical music, like real classical music, than any neoclassical tech death bands.
Yeah. They're going for something that is, it's very clearly operating. It's kind of indifferent to the material in which it's being delivered.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like this is an extremely heavy and aggressive record, but those are as far from being prioritized as anything. You know, its viciousness. Its viciousness kind of comes from its flatness.
That's what I mean. The viciousness is like, the whole point is, how are you generating vicious? We talk about that on the show a lot, right? The viciousness should be coming from the riffing. The viciousness should be coming from the drum playing and all that, right? And not from production tricks or from studio wizardry or whatever. And this is that idea, which is fundamental to good extreme metal or good music in general. I think just carried to a real extreme. They're like, certain kinds of records have that solid underlying architecture of songwriting, and then a bunch of cool... as you say, cool, meaty content layered over it. This is just the bones. This is just like watching bones dance.
Yeah, this is very deliberately nihilistic in the way of early death metal, as far as how it's presented. So one more sample from me from the final track, Nada of Creation Collapses onto Primal Bindu. So one criticism that's probably going to be leveled at this record by some people is that it all sounds the same, and it all basically operates at the same pace, and there's not really any variation.
Someone says that in the YouTube comments.
Oh, do they?
Calling me names.
I didn't see that, but in a sense, this is true. This is extremely rigorously homogeneous music, but I feel like we've established on this show that's kind of the point of extreme metal, is it, for it to be...
yes.
At least for the most part. I mean, yeah, you can have records that are like ambitious and they're doing weird things and have lots of timbral variation, but for the most part, we want 90% of it to be sort of flatly homogeneous, to draw emphasis to content rather than form. But I'd also argue that there's a ton of subtlety and a ton of like dynamic pacing to be found within these songs, but the sort of organizational principles are reversed from what you would expect. Let's say typical death or black metal band, everything is built as the structural conceit is all based around riffs. It's based on, okay, this riff before this riff before this riff, how many times do we repeat them? And everything sort of flows around that. And that's fine. That's been working for extreme metal for 30 plus years, so we don't need to stop doing that. However, here, what you're going to see is that where sort of drum rhythm variations would be used to recontextualize riffs and get more juice out of them, that doesn't really happen here. The drum performance on this record is really excellent, but it's also extremely static and mechanical, and that's completely deliberate. So instead what you'll hear is a reversed relationship where you'll have this continuous, like, unerring flow of mechanical blast beats with riffs swapping in and out around them. It's very rare that you hear a riff repeated a bunch of times with varying drum beats under it, unless you have a deliberately droning part like at the end of Shabalingam. So let's listen to this track, where I think if you listen closely, you'll hear a lot of really subtle kind of dynamic push-pull in the way these riffs flow into each other. And I'm guessing this is a record really designed around a guitarist and a drummer setting things out part by part. This is not constructed around guitar in the way that most extreme metal is. Yes, I think you can hear, like, on this segment in particular, it's become so traditional for extreme metal bands to explore the space of a riff by varying drum beats underneath. Obviously, it's a classic technique, but here it feels like the riffs and the drum beats are a lot more purpose-built for each other, especially in some of those longer, kind of elaborate sequences. Like, I think it's the second riff, which is sort of a 10-4 configuration. You've got like 2 4/4 bars and then a cut time bar to kind of wrap it up as a coda. You will hear little inflections in the riff, even if it's a supposedly looping melodic segment. Okay, there will be a little bit of trill to match up with sort of a broken blast beat in one repetition of this melodic sequence. So these riffs are actually a lot longer than they appear, but they're based off of internal call and response variations between the drummer and the guitarist, which makes it super distinct. These do not flow like regular songs. They feel very arbitrary at first until you sort of get into the internal logic of it, and then it's clear. There's no other way for them to go.
One thing I like here is that there is not the convention that you need to stop playing blast beats. Right?
Yeah, no, there's no compunction.
I was thinking about that yesterday. It's like the fucking aversion to Norse core or whatever, right, that happened meant like constant stream of blast beats was stigmatized. And certainly there's war metal that embraces that, but it's unusual to get music that is highly varied in terms of riff, tons of different riffs or phrases and kind of ambitious and arty. It's unusual to hear just constant stream of blast beats in that, right? And there's this kind of dumb stigma that attached to it after the late 90s, after 1349 or whatever. But, the point is, it wasn't constant blast beats that made Norsecore bad or get old really quick. It was bad riffs. Like, sort of phoned in Walmart Norse and Swedish riffs. And it was like, maybe you could say, like, triggered drums and, like, monotone drumming. This guy's always playing blast, but he's switching back and forth. Organic. He's switching back. There's several different kinds of blasts on this record, maybe more than several. And there's this constant alternation between 16th and 8th note blasting. It's never like hyper blast. It's never super speedy because the whole point is demarking time, right? Clipping these different, interacted with the riff at this point, right? It's always supposed to have this very deliberate pacing. But there's a constant willingness to switch up types of blasts that creates a lot of variation. And like you were saying, what they're doing with the guitar over, continuous blasting creates variation.
Yeah. And really this kicks back to when we were talking about the whole brutal death thing and its relation to that. You listen to the drumming style here, it's like obviously this has to be cultivated in some part in technique from not just brutal death, but stuff like Last Days of Humanity. The idea of these like paralyzingly long sort of hypnotic blast beat passages. Or you can even see how certain aspects of the riffing here reflect like the Oscar Ortega sort of microcellular riffing styles we've seen on his projects. This just appears to be a band that takes the idea of extremity itself very seriously, and just for that, it's brilliant.
One more thing I want to say. I know that was our potential show-stopping or segment-stopping outro line. We usually throw a few of those out there and see what sticks. But something that might be a little pedantic, but I think is worth talking about, and would be that something that might have confused our listeners there is that we were using form and content in opposite senses as we were reviewing this. So, so you were using them in the sort of in a way, I think both senses make sense, right? You were using the sort of colloquial sense where you're like, they're stripping away all the packaging, form as packaging, and delivering the content. Yeah. That is, they're stripping away all the production frills and whatnot, and they are giving you purely, purely just brutal, intricate death metal riffing, right? And I was using it the opposite sense to say they're really focusing on structure as opposed to you could think of like when you're talking about the content, in some way it's the form, right? It's the organization of these notes in time, right? It's that really sort of that's the thing that transfers, whether we play it on kazoo, or it'd be fucking hard on kazoo, right? That's the thing that transfers, whether we play it on acoustic guitar or piano or whatever, right? And in some sense, like the timbre or timbre or whatever, like the timbral qualities, the sonic space in the production, and all this other stuff is kind of the matter that's being given a certain form, or the content that's being given a certain form. And in some bands, that sort of, you could say that in like doom, certain kinds of doom, that kind of stuff that might ordinarily be the content becomes part of the organizing principle, right? Like, you know, you're really concerned with timbre because that determines when the note ends, right? You know, but like, so I think like, so I guess I was using it in the sort of like technical aesthetic sense or whatever, right? But the point is, for our listeners, we're talking about the same thing. It's that this band is distilling death metal down to its foundational architecture.
All right, we are back from probably one of the most dour and scowling records we've covered this year with something completely different. Something that's ready for your next death metal barbecue get-together. This is the new Holocausto Canibal with Crueza Ferina. This is out on Self-Made God and a couple other labels, sort of a co-op release type thing. So Holocausto Canibal is a band that I've really liked for a lot of years now. They are guys who... it's a band from Portugal. They've been around for, I think, going on around 25 years now. And they're following in the footsteps of the whole sort of hemorrhage grind gore thing. There's sort of a whole lineage of... sort of, for lack of a better term, Latin bands doing a sort of gory death grind style that's sort of taken from necroticism era Carcass is going to be sort of the origin, injected with a little bit of punk and hardcore in varying degrees, and it's remained kind of unchanged for a lot of years. Ever since Hemorrhage put out their first record so many years ago, there's always been bands doing this style, and Holocausto Canibal is one of the best. Now, to try to describe this is interesting because I think while this music has remained sort of unchanged for over 20 years now, the whole context around it is very different. If you were listening to an album like this 15 years ago, you probably wouldn't even necessarily... You wouldn't use terms like crusty to describe it. You wouldn't really associate it with punk much at all. But as the more extreme reaches of punk and metal have started to fuse more, and moreover that the audiences have become more familiar with both sides of it, now you'll see a lot of people calling this stuff like, D-beat death grind, stuff like that. Which is one of the things that I kind of want to talk to you about, because I know you're unfamiliar with this band and not really familiar with this lineage of bands in general. Where do you place this kind of in the spectrum? Because we've covered some very D-beat gore grind stuff early on in the show. We've been listening to more and more stuff that's sort of fusing death and grind and crust and D-beat together. Yeah. Where does this fall in the political compass, I guess?
Yes, yeah. Well, where would you say... I could throw that back to you as a series of questions, but what I'd say is this certainly has a number of D-beat sections in it. Those don't seem to be the center of gravity in the music.
Yeah, that's fair.
There is a real connect... they're not the center of gravity in the music. You've got a sample that highlights some of the better D-beat riffing. I'd like to hear that. Overall, though... what I would say is I found the D-beat parts often fun because they're occurring in the context of, a song starts off with D-beats after another one just ended on blasts or whatever, right? They're effective within the structure of the songs and more so with the album as a whole. It's like, oh yeah, I like D-beats. Yes, it's the D-beat part. But they're not they're not the core of the riffing or the center of the aggressive energy, which I think is reserved for the, blasting and super slowdown parts.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting take for Holocausto Canibal. This is their 6th full-length record, I believe, and the first one of all new material in about 10 years. They did a re-recording of their debut record, I want to say 5 years ago, but it's been pretty quiet apart from little EPs and splits here and there. So one thing that you mentioned, the super slowdown parts, the really intense sort of pit riff stuff that goes on this record is kind of new for the band. Maybe they're responding to some of the more hardcore influenced death metal that's coming out now, but it also feels like just kind of a logical extension of the stuff they were already doing, in a sense.
Yeah, so, how would we position this? So, as far as the crust thing also, you could say, I think this band does have it's more than just the fact they use D-beats. I think there's a significant connection to crust, but it's not... And it's in the D-beats, but it's also in something else that's a little less expected, which I think I can point out in one of my samples. But there seems to be some stench stuff going on here in kinds of aspects of the more atmospheric stuff.
Yeah, this is a pretty dynamic record. There's a whole lot of different ingredients in the mixture, and it seems to be an album built around sort of cycling through those ingredients, emphasizing or de-emphasizing certain ones, and that's the sort of structural conceit for like how individual tracks are laid out.
So one thing I want to say about like placing this in the gory death grind constellation is, so we have a few things like that pretty recently in Terminus history. How would you place this relative to, say, the Pharmacist we reviewed? Because that's also very Carcass influenced, but that's like Heartwork influenced Carcass? Heartwork era Carcass?
Yeah, so, well, Pharmacist is kind of interesting because, like, the first Pharmacist record is much closer to something like Symphonies of Sickness. And then the new one that we covered just the other day is much more in the kind of necroticism and Heartwork vein, which I've noticed is kind of a thing with deeply Carcass-inspired bands in general. They like to jump around the discography. A lot of the time they end up sort of recreating the same progression that Carcass did originally. It's very strange. Now, in comparison to Pharmacist, one, this is more directly traditional in terms of this sort of, micro style of gory, Carcass-inspired death grind, because after decades of iteration on the sound, it's come to feature its own sort of musical conventions. Like, the D-beat thing was never big for Carcass originally. There was a little bit, but it was never, like, a focal point. There weren't established D-beat sections that would be dropped into songs in the way that you do with the sort of Hemorrhage lineage of bands. This would be closer, I would say, to something like Regurgitation from Sweden, who is another death grind band who has always kind of floated nebulously between death and gore grind and crust, emphasizing different aspects at different points in their discography.
Regurgitation or Regurgitate?
Regurgitate, my bad.
Okay, word.
Yeah, Carnivorous Erection, Regurgitate, yeah.
Right. So, another comparison would be the Lord Gore that we reviewed on the bonus episode the other week. That has clean production, a lot of D-beats, and is a death grind record. How would you compare that?
Well, I think that something fundamentally goes differently between those two records, which is interesting because, like you suggested, they kind of have the same basic DNA at the heart.
Right.
But where I think the center of gravity in Lord Gore is based around, I think, a kind of confused idea of old school death metal, these little kind of concessions to the idea of autopsy, kind of doomy parts and stuff. Here, the center of gravity is based in its own understanding of grind. And moreover, I think that Holocausto Canibal is interesting because as the lines of the genres have all kind of blurred and been iterated on over the years, you get the sense that even with the crust parts and even with the DB parts, those are arrived at through listening to other metal bands doing them.
For sure.
Yeah, you don't get the sense that these guys are listening to much crust punk like on their own. They're getting it filtered through a lot of metal bands that are also into that, I think.
If there's any, we'll get to it on my sample, but I think if there's anything to suggest they do listen to crust, it's not the D-beat parts.
Oh, now I'm intrigued.
Yeah, all right, so let's go.
Well, okay, so I'm gonna do a sample. This is gonna be two short tracks in a row. This is like a 19-track album, and it's just over 30 minutes. So these are pretty brief songs. So we're gonna go from. Let's see. So the first one is going to be Ancestres Ritos Hypoxicos and to Apresto Executorio. And what I think is really cool here is that when you listen to a lot of this sort of like D-beat connected, gory, grindy stuff, a lot of the time the bands tend to hold back because they're pursuing groove, they're pursuing a certain kind of party atmosphere, and the extremity tends to be sacrificed at least a little bit. Holocausto Canibal isn't interested in that. The actual gore grind aspects, this sort of like ever-present last days of humanity hovering in the background, is definitely present on this record, which is one of the things that I think makes it a way better party record than any of the bands really searching for that style. So you can imagine a version of this record where they tone some of this stuff down. You know, they don't pitch shift the vocals, they don't let gravity blasts happen, and they're doing that in the pursuit of this being sort of metalhead good time music, which I've never understood because I thought part of being into extreme metal was, you know, liking really fast blast beats and like really disgusting.
Let gravity
vocals.
Blasts happen. Let
Exactly.
gravity blasts happen.
Exactly. They're here, they're fast, get used to it. But yeah, so it's like, that's so cool, is like, you know, after you get off the kind of slowed down crush ending of the first track, you have that second and a half of breathing room, and then this progressively escalating series of blast beats capping off in that just fucking ridiculously high-speed gravity blast there. And I really appreciate that about the record. It's that the point of this music is to be very extreme, and the fun that we find in it, the sort of party mood that we get out of it, should arise naturally from it being really extreme, and you, like, cackling at how fucking brutal it is. So.
Yeah, this is big cackling jams, for sure. You know, a part I really liked there that I cackled during, as you heard, was, the breakdown pretty early in the sample, did you just do the whole track there?
Well, yeah, all the two tracks, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. Okay, so the breakdown, that was probably in Ancestres Ritos y Poxicos or something. Who knows? There's a slow part, and they do a quick pause, like it sounds like they're about to hit the blast beat again, and instead the vocalist just does a and they sort of, instead they sort of convolute the rhythm in the breakdown, so it gets even more ignorant. And that's really cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of, you can really tell these are guys that have been playing together just for an absurdly long time. You get the sense that there's these, like, cackling musical in-jokes with just some of the... This isn't a technical record, but there's parts of it that are, like, deceptively challenging, usually, like, very strange timing inflection, stuff like that. The sort of subtle musicality you only get with guys you know really well.
Hey, some of us find playing really fast inherently challenging.
I mean, I do too, but I have to pretend for the listeners that I know what I'm doing.
But yeah, no, I hear that for sure. I mean, that's something that's true about the Portuguese BM scene too, right? Is this sense of brotherhood that they've the guys in the circle formerly known as the Black Circle, right? Those guys all are bros who've played with each other for like decades. And so maybe it's a Portuguese kind of thing. Maybe they're just really good at that.
It's just all about the vibes, I guess.
You stay true to the hometown boys.
So what have you got here? I'm interested because this is so outside your conventional wheelhouse. What kind of things you wanted to emphasize with the samples?
All right, so both my samples on this have kind of a similar structure, which is just a really fast part, really slow part. But the second one, this one is a more sort of complex version of that pattern, and the end of this one, there's a couple variants of the slowdown here, and the second variant starts getting into that potential actual crust influence. lesser band would not have gone back to the Gravity Blast.
These guys refused to be that lesser band. Always back to the Gravity. You see, that was because that actually, you mentioned it earlier, but actually when I was listening to this album, I was thinking of the Lord Gore thing. And it's like, when do these sort of like spooky town slow riffs land, and when don't they? You know, and I think that it really just has to do with kind of like preparation. You know, it's not even really about the riff itself, it's just how you get there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's high... Yes, the riff itself is basically just like cut and paste South of Heaven type thing, right? But, like, that's fine, right? And it's all about the way it's following on this really intense blast passage. I mean, a thing I think I'm realizing on this show is that when I was younger, I thought I didn't like gravity blasts, and now I'm realizing I like gravity blasts.
Yeah, it's just a blast beat, but you do even faster. What's not to like?
Yeah. But I told my priest, and he says I'm going to hell. So he said I was. He took away my punk card. But the gravity blasts are cool. But in that deceleration to the to this kind of spooky part, those are the parts that make me think there might be some actual crust influence here. It's not that one individual passage, which if you isolate it could just be Slow Slayer. But, like, especially I'm not going to sample it because it's the intro and it doesn't have blast beats, but I really like the intro, which is Psychotico Interludio. And that has these just kind of slow building, gloomy minor chords that then starts to get some like more textured droning guitar stuff coming in over it, right? And that is a lot like a stench part. It's almost like if you just decided to do the kind of thing that like Deviated Instinct did, but do it in a very modern way, it would sound kind of like that, where it sounds kind of like the stenchy aspects of Sepultura. It's very, there are parts on this that have kind of a little bit more of a majestic minor key evil and or majestic sounding minor key tonality. They're very slow and kind of chuggy or crushing. And those parts I like a lot. I kind of wish there were more of them. And they have kind of a what if we modernize stenchcore vibe to it. Yeah,
and I think in a lot of ways that might just be... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, and by modernized, I don't mean like... I mean, well, stench is a pretty narrow thing. There are some great bands doing original takes on that style right now, especially Fodom. But, like, it's more that, like, by modernized, I mean you deliver similar ideas, but with, like, beefy kind of, digital production, super heavy digital production. Right.
Yeah, I think that what might be happening is that maybe these guys access these sort of like crust roots of Carcass better than a lot of people do, because you got to remember it's like the kids in Carcass were basically like peace punks who also happen to like death metal. So moments like those slowdowns were present in early Carcass, but I think Holocausto Canibal understands their role and understands their purpose a little bit better, rather than just kind of mindlessly replicating it because it's what Carcass did, you know.
That would make sense, yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of the sort of punk aspects, I think that after a couple years of doing this show, I'm at the point where I think I know what makes a good D-beat riff. Because you've talked about it. You've described it in the way someone describes a sunset. It's very hard to break it down into a series of rules. But you've always emphasized weird little fluctuations in timing, you know, where you're putting in slides, little subtleties that kind of just whiz past you until you've listened to a ton of these riffs. So I'm going to go to the song Campas do Negro Bru, where there's a series of kind of D-beat riffs that I think will pass the test for you as the actual good ones. So, D-beat guy, are those the riffs you're looking for?
Yes, those are great. I mean, it's not. I wouldn't. It's not like a top. It's not written to be a super unique D-beat riff. It doesn't but it's not like top shelf. It's not like a band specializing in this sort of thing, or like the occasional death metal band that just is really good at writing them. Mm-hmm. But it's it's conspicuously better than most of the other D-beat parts on this record. There's something about, I think it's just they're playing it faster, not too fast. They're not like, they still want it to have that groove, but a lot of the other ones have this kind of like bands like this use D-beat riffs as mid-tempo riffs. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I think I just figured that out.
I get the distinction you're making, where the DB bands, those are the fast parts. Here, they're kind of like a groove thing for death metal bands, who are used to just operating at a way higher top speed.
Exactly, and you can play a groove, you can play a D-beat riff in this kind of shuffling, slow skank way and make it really heavy, evidence being Coffins, right? Or Winter. But, like, that's its own kind of thing. And so mostly what you have on here are, most of the riffs I'd characterize here as kind of like on the Lord Gore, is sort of sounding like, Behind Enemy Lines, or, Aus Rotten, or these kind of like, these kind of chunky, slow by D-beat terms, kind of chunky, bluesy riffs, right? Mm-hmm. Which are not, work fine in the songs, but are not remarkable by D-beat standards. This, they're pushing the tempo a little more. There's something about, you could hear them articulating the ends of the chords really well. Mm-hmm. Like the sort of more trilled part on the end of each chord. And there's something about the timing in the way that they draw up. You know the turnaround at the end? Mm. That goes up one chord more than it has to. Or even two chords more than it has to. Goes up one... And the way they're sort of like syncopating that is very heavy. So I think it's a well-written D-beat riff.
Yeah, it's that one really caught my ear. And of course, just the giant pit riff at the end is pitch perfect. It's probably one of the best on the record.
Dude, I loved that. Yeah, it's, I love they just count it off for way longer than you think they should count it off, and then play it for way longer than you expect them to play it. It's the other thing about the D-beat thing is or there's a classic, a thing about the Japanese, I don't know them well, but a guy whose writing I used to read talked about this, that the Japanese band Gauze, always, the sort of noisecore D-beat band, always said that they played fast by playing slow. And so, like, D-beat riffs can often be lower tempo than you expect them to be, but they feel fast because of the syncopations and the way that the way the chords throw into one another.
Yeah, that sort of whiplash effect.
Yeah. That's a by D-beat terms, that's not even a particularly fast D-beat riff. Mm-hmm. But it feels very fast, and that's important. There's a real sort of forward momentum and shape to it. And also just, high levels of dissonance, which is also pretty essential. Mm-hmm. Anyway. So let's, if you're good with that one, let's go into Que Rulo dos Finados. This is the same general plan as Suprema Dominancia, right? Go really fast, then go slow. But they have a good way of taking these templates and filling them in with meaningfully different... here I'm using the word content in a slightly different way, but, filling them with meaningfully different content, right? You have the grid, the outline of the song, and then the particular riffs coming in are different. And you get a really brutal contrast here. Dude, we were just saying during that breakdown, this sounds Mexican.
It's like it's a Portuguese band, but it has huge cholo energy to it.
Dude, yes, that's totally in the school of like LA Cholo Doom Death beatdown, right? Like
yeah.
It's like Xibalba Crew type groove or whatever, or like Ruin. I assume Ruin are Mexican.
Well, I love how these guys just continuously make the decision of when we find the best riff in the song, we just keep playing it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so that one is awesome. But then the other thing I want to talk about real quick is the wind up. You know that right? It's just the like they're doing a bluesy thing in a really cool way. They're just going from like the whole step under the root to the root. And it's that's the kind of riff you can only write in a grind band. In the notes you mentioned Internal Rot, right? As having a similar kind of subtlety. Yeah. And I think that's true. I think Internal Rot is way more radical, I think, in a lot of ways, and because they're working further away from traditional riff forms, I think they write more distinctive riffs. But this band is doing that specific kind of, you could call it like noise riffing or whatever, right? Where it's kind of just hyper compressed nonsense stuff, and then they break it up with the DB part, which is purely for pacing, but is a very fast DB part, and then they just do it again. That is I really like hearing grind bands grinding.
Why have many note when few note do trick?
Begin with breaking news at 11. A 6-year-old is dead after someone shot into a Pomona home.
Police suspect there's possibly a drive-by shooting.
This man and woman shot to death, known by a lot of people here in this neighborhood.
Country is going on, and then we seen a cop going after them. After they went back to this street, and then they just started hearing gunshots. We weren't sure if they were like real gunshots when we came out, and we smelled the gunpowder. They were real gunshots.
Did you guys know what happened?
From what I heard is a cop got shot. Typical day in Pomona.
but everyone can pretty much agree that the Mexicans run LA. Is that a fair assessment?
I'm definitely, I'll say we run Southern California.